Hello, afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Uncle Yeow and the Singapore Story. Today is a very special edition that I'm going to talk about. It is about Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore's greatest son. He is also the founding father of modern Singapore. Now, this Saturday, 16 September, marks the 100th anniversary of the birth of Lee Kuan Yew. So it is very significant. Now, a lot of people will be sharing different aspects of his contribution. For me, I will share my own personal take on his contribution to Singapore as a whole. First of all, the most important to me was the word stability. Now, how did Lee Kuan Yew brought stability to Singapore all these years, right from the very beginning? Now, let's start with 1959. All right, Singapore gained full self-government from the British government. Full self-government, but not independence. All right, because internal security and foreign relations still fall under the ambit of the British government. Now, in that year, when we had our first general election, the PAP had a landslide victory, and Lee Kuan Yew became our first founding prime minister. From there onwards, it was very tumultuous period. Why? Because he had to fight the communists. Alright, otherwise we have gone over to the communists. So 1959 and then to 1962, when we had to hold our referendum on whether to join Malaysia or not. Now during this period, nobody ever believed Singapore could be independent on our own. Not the British, not even Lee Kuan Yew himself. Why? Because we have a very small domestic market, only 1 million people. We do not have any natural resources. We have no hinterland, and therefore we rely on Malaysia to be our hinterland. And not only that, even water we have to get from Malaya. So because for all these reasons, at the end, we decided to join Malaysia after the referendum. So significantly, the date was also 16 September 1963. That was the day when Singapore became a part of Malaysia. But unfortunately, it was not a happy partnership. It was not a happy marriage. Why? Because Singapore, especially our leaders under Lee Kuan Yew, what we wanted was a Malaysian Malaysia. That means everyone's equal, regardless of race, language, or religion. But the leaders on the other side, what they wanted was a Malay Malaysia. Malays have special rights. So because of this, there was a lot of unrest, quarrels, and squabble. So much so that in the end, by 1965, 9 August, Tengku Abdul Rahman, the first Prime Minister of Malaysia, announced, Singapore, you're too troublesome, so out you go. So we were actually kicked out of Malaysia. Now during this period, Singapore also experienced what is known as Indonesian confrontasi. Alright, because the Indonesians were not in favor of the setup of Malaysia. So they took it out on Singapore and Malaysia. So the biggest incident in Singapore was 42 locations were bombed during this period, and the most significant one was the McDonald House bombing by 2 Indonesian Marines. Now before they could escape, they were caught. Alright, 3 persons died and 33 were injured in that incident. Eventually, these 2 Marines were hanged by Singapore. And then that drew a lot of flack from the Indonesian government. So much so that we went into a very bad relationship with Indonesia. But 1963, we became in Malaysia. But by 1965, we gained independence from Malaysia because we were kicked out of Malaysia. And then by 1973, Lee Kuan Yew actually went to their grave in Jakarta, alright, and he sprinkled flowers over the grave. Now this brought closure to the event, and Singapore became very good friends with Indonesia, especially under President Suharto. So Lee Kuan Yew was very thankful to President Suharto for giving Singapore and the region 40 years of peace and stability for us to grow and to prosper economically. Now, many of you may not have known, but actually Lee Kuan Yew was also a fighter, alright? And he fought many battles. Fortunately for us, he won all the battles. If not, our history would have been very different. Now, in the 60s and 70s, we had to fight corruption, number one. We had to fight crimes, and then we have to fight the secret society. Now, all these he overcame. Of course, he had help from all his colleagues, the pioneer generation leaders. Now, because of this, we managed to bring stability not only regionally, but also more importantly, domestically. Alright, we had a period of political stability that enabled us to grow. And therefore, Singapore prospered during these years. So that's very important. Alright, if Lee Kuan Yew were to have lost any of the battles, our history would have been very different. Alright, we will not know what is going to happen, what will become of Singapore today. So, stability is number one. Now, other than stability, another area that a lot of people do not talk of was actually environmental sustainability. Now, Lee Kuan Yew, right from the very beginning, believed in environmental sustainability, even though nobody in the world talks about it. Okay, 1963, we started tree planting, and he was the first to start tree planting campaign. Now, over the years, Singapore have planted more than 2 million trees in Singapore. And what has that done for us? Well, it actually brought down our surface temperature by 2 to 3 degrees. That's why you find that Singapore, even though it's a very hot climate, but it is still bearable. And not only that, right from the beginning, he designated Singapore to be a clean and green garden city. Now, at the time, nobody actually paid attention, and a lot of people think that it's a waste of money and time. But he actually paid dividends over the years. Now, you remember, right from the beginning when we moved to Changi Airport, from Changi Airport coming into the city, alright, on both sides of the road and even the middle road divider, it was all trees and flora. So much so that for any visitors who come to Singapore, they were duly impressed by the greenery and the flowers all the way from Changi Airport to the city, and then on the journey back from the city to Changi Airport. So this gave actually a lasting impression to a lot of foreigners, especially the foreign investors. And it gave them confidence that Singapore was the place for them to park their money. And because of the political stability, alright, people felt very safe. Singapore is the safest country in the world. Women, children, anyone, at any day of the time, day or night, you can walk freely in the streets. Alright, you won't have fear of being robbed or being mugged. So this is something unique about Singapore. And Lee Kuan Yew played a large part in that. On top of that, he invested heavily in our defense, because after independence, the British withdrew, we had to have our own defense and security. That's why we set up national service in 1967. Now, defense becomes a number one priority for Singapore. Why? Because of our experience with Indonesian confrontasi, and our neighbors at that time were not exactly friendly. So defense became so important, it became the number one item in our annual budget. Our defense budget is bigger than Malaysia and Indonesia. And we invest so much in the training of our personnel, especially our NS men. So all this actually brings about stability. Now, environmental sustainability, Singapore is the only country in the world where there is actually a gardening report that is submitted to cabinet for every cabinet meeting. So imagine the importance of greening the country. So this is something that not much has been talked about. Of course, not only greening of Singapore also the Singapore water story, all right, which we'll be talking about at another time. But what is significant is actually the cleaning up of the Singapore River and the Kallang Basin. Now in those days, whenever you take a bus down to city, before you reach the city, you could actually smell the Singapore River. That's how the stench of the Singapore River, how bad it was. Now in 1977, Lee Kuan Yew actually tasked all the government agencies to jointly clean up the Singapore River and the Kallang Basin. And PUB took the lead. All right. PWD and PUB. So together, Singapore cleaned up the Singapore River and the Kallang Basin in 10 years, from 1977 to 1987. Today, you find that the Singapore River is so clean. We even have now the Marina Barrage, which is actually one of the biggest reservoir in Singapore. In Singapore, all in all, we have 17 reservoirs to make sure that we collect all the rainwater so that it doesn't go to waste, it doesn't go into the sea. So reservoirs, catchment area, so that forms part of the Singapore water story. The other aspect is in terms of public housing. Now, right from the beginning, Lee Kuan Yew felt that everyone should have a stake in the country. And the best stake to have is actually your HDB flats. More than 90% of those who stay in HDB flats actually own the flats. We buy, we don't rent the flats. Now, this is important. Home ownership, having a stake in the country in terms of your HDB flat is so important, because it says if you want our children, our sons to serve NS, to defend the country, they must have a stake in the country. That is something for them to defend. And Singapore, what is unique about HDB flat is it is always very, very well maintained. Every 5 years, you get a new coat of paint, you get upgrading works, whatever. So that whenever you go around, you don't really find any rundown, dilapidated flats or buildings in Singapore. Singapore is very, very well maintained. And this gives an overall impression, especially when foreigners come, that Singapore is truly a clean and green city. And it is actually a place to do business, to live, work, and play. So all this, if you think about it, is actually largely the work of one man and his pioneer generation team of leaders. And that is the Singapore story that I want to leave with you, especially comes this Saturday on the 16th of September, when we remember the birth of Lee Kuan Yew 100 years ago in 1923. So ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can reflect, and it is important for future leaders to think about the wisdom and the legacies that is left behind by Lee Kuan Yew and the pioneer generation leaders, and take us into the next 50 years to SG 100. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time, and we must all be grateful, especially for having such a great son, a great Singapore son in Lee Kuan Yew, who is truly our founding father of modern Singapore. See you next time. Thank you.